Good day. Today is Friday, 28th February 2025, and I'm making this program between two visits to Washington, between two world leaders, one Keir Starmer of Britain, and the other Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine. Keir Starmer has been to Washington, he's had his meetings with Donald Trump, and it will be those meetings and that visit which I shall focus on principally in this program. Vladimir Zelensky is currently in the United States. He arrived like a thief in the night. Well, that might be a bit hard, actually. The point is that he appears to have arrived in his jet after nightfall at Andrews Air Force Base. I'm not quite sure where he stayed, but anyway, his meeting is due to begin over the course of today, and no doubt he'll be meeting with Donald Trump, and there will be a signing ceremony at which Zelensky is going to sign off on the minerals deal. I will come to all of that later in this program. But firstly, as I said, I'm going to focus on the meeting between Donald Trump and Keir Starmer, which played out over the course of yesterday. Now, to understand this visit, this Keir Starmer visit, it's actually important to go back and look at the British media, or at least refresh your mind as to what the British media have been saying in the week leading up to this meeting. In fact, from early last week, from around the time when the European powers, or at least some of them, met in Paris at the urgent insistence of President Macron and failed to agree on a way forward. But at that meeting in Paris, which, as I said, took place more than 10 days ago now, about 10 days ago, on Monday of last week, Keir Starmer came to Paris, came with a plan to deploy British troops as peacekeepers, or as a reassurance force, as it is now called, to Ukraine, supposedly to enforce any peace agreement or ceasefire that emerged out of the negotiations. And Starmer made comments at this meeting in Paris, and he said that the British were prepared to provide support for this peacekeeping force, that the British troops would be involved, that in fact they would take the lead and might even command this force. At least, I don't think that's what Starmer said, but there have been reports to that effect in Britain. Nonetheless, in order for this to work, there would need to be what Keir Starmer called an American backstop. In other words, the United States, the US military, in fact, would have to provide some kind of guarantee that if these European troops were deployed to Ukraine, and if they were attacked by the Russians, and the Russians have already made it clear, and have been making it clear throughout last week and throughout this week, that they are strongly opposed to the deployment of European troops in Ukraine and will never agree to it. And the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, Vasily Nebenzia, even went further and said that the only body with the authority to deploy peacekeepers is the UN Security Council, and that if authorization is not obtained from the UN Security Council for deployment of peacekeeping troops to Ukraine, and it's important to remember that Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council with rights of veto, that if that were to happen, the Russians would consider European troops deployed in Ukraine to be combatants in the ongoing conflict, and the Russians would attack them. Anyway, Starmer said that in order to avoid that possibility or to mitigate against that possibility, to ensure that those European troops led by the British would be protected in the event of a Russian attack, the US military backstop would in effect have to amount to some sort of a guarantee for those troops that the US military would have to be prepared to come to the rescue of those troops if they found themselves in a conflict scenario with the Russians. And, well, there have been various articles and suggestions in the British media over the last 2 weeks discussing what that backstop would be. It extends all the way from the United States providing air support, with suggestions that the United States might in effect enforce a no-fly zone over Ukrainian airspace. That has never been expressly said, but the implication of some of the articles has amounted to that. To other suggestions that the United States should supply intelligence support and logistical support, though obviously as part of a backstop that would have to go much further in the event that the European force found itself actually attacked by the Russians, which it's important to reiterate, the Russians have said that if it is deployed without their agreement and without the authorization of the UN Security Council, would in fact be the case. So that was what Starmer was talking about last week. That's what the British were talking about last week. There were lots of articles in the media about this. It was fairly clear that Emmanuel Macron was fully up for this idea. Other European countries were not keen. The Germans said that it was all very premature. The outgoing German government, which is still in place, by the way, has reiterated that position today. Other countries like Poland were strongly critical. Italy and Italy and Spain basically said that they would not be involved. But this was very much the project that Starmer and Macron wanted to run with. And that explains their 2 trips to the United States this week. It's easy to forget if you look at the British media today, which talks very little about this whole backstop military guarantee idea. It's very easy to forget, but last week and in the early part of this week, the British media was making it very clear that it was in order to get Donald Trump to provide some kind of reassurance that there would be this American backstop to the European force that would be deployed in Ukraine, that Starmer and previously Macron were going to Washington. And I'm going to here express my own view. Macron and Starmer were clearly heavily coordinating with each other. This is not controversial. It has been confirmed by the media in Britain and I believe also in France too. But I also believe that the level of coordination went beyond those two. I believe that Vladimir Zelensky was also brought in on the act, and this sequence of visits to Washington, which we have seen take place this week, Macron on Monday, Starmer on Thursday, which is to say yesterday, Zelensky today, that all of this was coordinated and agreed in advance. Now, we have some evidence for this because the French media are now saying that when Macron arrived in the United States on Monday, he found that the Americans, that Donald Trump personally, were very, very reluctant to receive Zelensky on Friday of this week. That, in fact, Donald Trump was close to cancelling the visit to the United States by Zelensky. And that it was Macron who had to talk him out of doing so. So we see that Macron certainly appears to have been acting as a kind of lobbyist on Zelensky's behalf in the United States when he met with Trump on Monday. And as I said, I'm fairly sure that the British, the British, the French, and the Ukrainians were coordinating and working with each other and had planned with each other the various moves. Now, I'm afraid I'm going to have to go back a little and discuss some of the events of the past, the recent past, to explain what I think played out this week. Now, this centres on the minerals deal, which Zelensky and Trump are supposed to sign off on today. Now, the minerals deal, as few people seem to understand, but as has been pointed out by Dr. Jack Rasmus in an excellent article, which you can find in various media outlets, the World Financial Review being one, I believe Counterpunch is another. Anyway, Dr. Jack Rasmus points out, the title of the article is "The Real Trump-Zelensky $500 billion minerals deal." Anyway, as Dr. Jack Rasmus correctly points out, this whole idea for the minerals deal actually was first floated by none other than Zelensky. The idea of money from Ukraine's mineral wealth in exchange for US aid is a Zelensky proposal raised last fall when the Biden administration was still in power, and it was clear that the US Congress would not pass further legislation after its $61 billion aid package enacted early last summer. Raising the idea of minerals wealth in exchange for more aid last fall was thus a Zelensky effort to restart the flow of US funds to Ukraine. That's what Dr. Rasmus says, and he is exactly right. That is exactly how I recall it. In fact, as I remember, he first floated this idea with his friend, Lindsey Graham, and Lindsey Graham came out and spoke about it in the media, and many people assumed that it was Lindsey Graham's idea, but it clearly originated with Zelensky. And then Zelensky met with Trump in September and had a discussion with Trump in Trump Tower in New York, and he floated this idea before Trump again. And then he unveiled it in his victory plan a few weeks later, his so-called victory plan, which basically demanded unlimited US support plus immediate NATO entry for Ukraine. And, well, that was the original genesis of this whole idea of Ukraine giving a share of its mineral wealth to the United States. In effect, it was a bribe for continued US military aid. Now, after Trump became president, the Ukrainians again reverted to this proposal. And in this, I have no doubt that they had the backing of the British and the French. And the idea again was wave this mineral deal in front of Donald Trump. It is taken as read in Britain and in France, in London and Paris, that Donald Trump is a deeply transactional individual, that he has no real principles, that he's only out for what he can get. That's very much the cynical take, as I said, in London and Paris about Donald Trump. So it was expected that if he was presented with this mineral deal, he would fall for it. He would take the $11 trillion of minerals that he was told was being offered. A figure, by the way, 11 trillion, which now looks to be completely fictitious, that he would fall for this, resume support for Ukraine, recommit to Ukraine, pour more money into Ukraine, strong-armed Congress into authorizing more funds and more weapons for Ukraine, and that would provide support for the war. Anyway, it turned out otherwise. Donald Trump did want the agreement. He did want an agreement on minerals. But he said that he wanted it not as a trade or as a bribe for further US financial and military aid going forward, but for repayment or eventual repayment of the financial and military aid the United States has already sent to Ukraine. And here, Dr. Rasmus has actually gone much deeper into unpacking the figures than I think other people have done. And I'm not going to go deeply into all of Dr. Rasmus's calculations, but Dr. Rasmus takes the view that Donald Trump's suggestion that the United States has spent around $350 billion supporting Ukraine over the last 3 years is probably much closer to the truth than the far lower figures, the much lower figures that Zelensky and others have been quoting. I'll just quote these words from Dr. Rasmus. The true amount of US aid to Ukraine, military, as well as to pay salaries of the Ukraine government in the past 3 years, is undoubtedly closer to the $350 billion than the $70 billion quoted by Zelensky. Zelensky himself has previously stated the cost of paying Ukraine government salaries and employee pensions is $8 billion a month. The total for 3 years is close to $300 billion. Much of US aid to Ukraine since February 2022 has therefore been to finance the Ukraine cost of paying government salaries and the government, not just to provide military aid. In total, it's likely to be between $300 billion and $400 billion. And Dr. Rasmus also makes the point that the estimate that Ukraine only received $70 billion of military aid conveniently ignores that the Biden administration passed legislation last summer that alone provided $61 billion in military aid, to which has been added a still undetermined amount by the Biden administration in the weeks after the US November election. Moreover, the $70 billion is an estimate for military aid, not other forms of aid the United States has provided over the past 3 years. So it's more likely, according to Dr. Rasmus, that Trump is right about the amounts already sent to Ukraine, not Zelensky. And I agree with him. I am sure he is correct. But anyway, Trump came round and said to Zelensky, I will take the minerals. Thank you very much for offering me the minerals, but I'm not going to accept it as a bribe for future US military aid. I'm going to accept it as a mechanism to repay the aid, the investment in your country, which we have already made. And that was not what Zelensky expected, and I suspect it was not what London and Paris expected either. And we know that when the Treasury Secretary, the US Treasury Secretary, Scott Bassent, went to Kiev and explained all of this to Zelensky, Zelensky became furious, and there was a shouting match apparently. Apparently the Financial Times, no less, has confirmed this, and I saw an article about it in the Daily Telegraph. And when the proposal was put to Zelensky by Rubio and Vance at the Munich Security Conference, well, Zelensky refused to sign. And then, as I've discussed in other programs, in recent programs, what appears to have happened is that Boris Johnson telephoned Zelensky and talked him round, and so did Kellogg, who was also apparently in Kiev, and they told him, look, you've got to sign this proposal. It was you who floated it in the first place. Trump is taking this as a sign of extreme bad faith on your part, that you are not prepared to sign it. But trust us, you will get your security guarantees from the Americans. We, that is to say the British and the French, will get them for you. And that, I think, is what we have seen play out over this last week. Trump was furious. He told Macron on Monday that he was not prepared to see Zelensky this week. He was furious over the fact that the Ukrainians were not prepared to sign the minerals deal. Macron told him, don't worry, we'll get it sorted out. The Ukrainians will sign. And please do, therefore, agree to meet with Zelensky this Friday. And we can assure you that the minerals deal will be on the table and you can sign it. And we understand that you're looking for this minerals deal to pay off the money you've already spent, not as some kind of down repayment for money that you're going to be asked to give in the future. And then, of course, what followed was first Macron's attempts on Monday and Starmer's attempts yesterday to move Trump towards giving, if not Ukraine security guarantees, Trump has categorically ruled that out, to give guarantees, a backstop to the British and the French. And the key thing to understand is that in practical terms, there is no difference. If the United States were to give a backstop to the Ukrainians, then it would be undertaking to come to Ukraine's assistance in its conflict with Russia. If it gave the kind of backstop to the British and the French that Starmer and Macron have been asking for, then the United States would be undertaking to come to the assistance of the British and the French in Ukraine if the conflict with Russia continued. And of course, since the British and the French would be in Ukraine, defending and assisting the Ukrainians, one can see how, in that kind of situation, the backstop would in effect translate into an American undertaking to support Ukraine. So this was, I think, the ploy, the game that was played this week, the trap. However, as I discussed in my program the day before yesterday, Trump in the event played Macron like a violin. He seems to have seen through Macron completely. He appeared at times to come very close to saying that the United States would indeed be fully supportive of the French and the British going into Ukraine. But he never gave the guarantee, the undertaking of American assistance that Macron was looking for. And as we shall see shortly, Macron has gone back to France and he feels very, very upset and very, very angry. And at the moment, he's saying all sorts of rather unpleasant things about the United States and about the kind of things that France ought to be doing. Macron has come away from the trip to Washington and he came away empty-handed. Now, my guess is that the original plan is that Macron, who is always supposed to be the cleverer man, the more supple negotiator, the man who knows how to play with words and weave complex, intricate words, that he would be the person on Monday who would get the Americans, get Trump to commit publicly to providing some kind of backstop. Then Starmer would come on Thursday and he'd come with all the proposals set out for the peacekeepers and the troops and all of that. And he'd go over the detail with Trump and he'd tell Trump, well, that's what you said you would do when you spoke to Macron on Monday. So I'm here to follow up on that and to flesh it out and to sort out the details. There is an assumption that Starmer is a better details person than Macron is. One comes across this a lot in Britain, that because Starmer is a lawyer who, trained and practiced law, he's better at he's good at detail. I've never seen any actual evidence of this myself, but you do hear this said from time to time. So it would be Starmer anyway who would come along and sort out the detail with Trump. And then, of course, Zelensky would come in triumph today, Friday. And of course, there would be no security guarantee in the actual minerals deal that he had finally agreed to sign. But it really wouldn't matter because the British and the French would have wangled a minerals deal instead out of a guarantee instead out of Donald Trump. So that would have put Zelensky in pole position and he would have been happy and glowing and he would have gone back to Kiev victorious with a bribe which he'd offered to the Americans, which he would of course never honor because most of the minerals that he's talking about probably don't exist. But he would have come back with the reality of some kind of guarantee from the Americans, not to Ukraine, but to Britain and France. And I think that was the plan. But as I said, Macron failed on Monday, and that put Starmer in a very difficult position because pretty much everybody would acknowledge that Starmer doesn't have the, shall we say, the negotiating skill, the flamboyance, the charisma, the personality, the charm that Macron is supposed to have, that Starmer is not, therefore, the best person to persuade Donald Trump to do something that Donald Trump doesn't want to do. And so what happened on Thursday is that Starmer came along and met with Trump and seems to have tried to carry on where Macron left off. But of course, he doesn't have Macron's flair and skill, or at least purported flair and skill. Trump had no difficulty seeing through Macron. And of course, he wasn't going to be fooled by Keir Starmer. And just as Trump ran rings round Macron on Monday, he did so to an even more embarrassing extent with Starmer yesterday. It has been an extraordinary thing to read the British media over the last 24 or so hours. They've been talking about how Starmer managed to get on famously with Donald Trump. That basically amounted to Starmer pretending to laugh at Trump's jokes, which Starmer, to be frank, is not very good at doing. There's been all sorts of talk about what a tremendous success this visit was, but no one, not a single article that I've read anywhere in the media in London, is able to come back with anything to show for this success, anything actually substantial to show. So there's talk that the Americans might, in fact, not impose the tough tariffs on Britain that they're threatening to impose on the Europeans. That's apparently something that Trump is supposed to have said. Perhaps he did say it, but it's all got to be negotiated going forward. And for the moment, it's just words. And I personally wouldn't put any great weight on it. It is not at all impossible that in 6 months' time, or 3 months' time, or 3 weeks' time, or indeed even tomorrow, the Americans might just decide that they're going to slap tariffs on Britain after all. As it happens, I don't think they will, for one overwhelmingly simple reason, which is that unlike China and the European Union, Britain is not a big exporter of manufactured goods to the United States. Britain, as everybody knows, has been through a major process of deindustrialization. It is not any longer a big exporter of manufactured goods. It does export some. It's good at exporting some products. I mean, Rolls-Royce produces advanced aircraft engines, for example. And of course, we have high-end cars, Land Rovers and Bentleys and that kind of thing, which are still made in Britain. And audio equipment, British audio equipment, is by all accounts still first rate and perhaps amongst the best in the world. This is what I've heard. But it's hardly a trade that is going to dent the US manufacturing sector to any great extent. It cannot be compared with the enormous trade surplus that China has and the enormous trade surplus that the European Union and I believe Japan, for example, and perhaps even South Korea and Taiwan still have. So for that reason, I don't think the Americans feel any particular imperative to impose sanctions on Britain. Britain runs trade deficits with most countries. It has a perennial deficit in its current account. It runs both budget and trade deficits. It needs inflows of capital from abroad. A lot of it, by the way, American, just saying, or at least some of it American. But when we look at things in the round, I don't really see why the Americans would want to impose tariffs on Britain. Just saying. But anyway, they did talk about that, Trump and Starmer. There's talk about some kind of trade deal on the horizon. Well, there was talk about a trade deal between Britain and the United States on the horizon during Trump's first term, and it never materialized. And there was also further talk about it during Biden's time, and it still didn't materialize. Perhaps at some point it will. Maybe it will happen at some point over the next 4 years, but I wouldn't put any money on it. And certainly we didn't get any conclusive, definite commitments from the Americans that would lead us to think that that was going to happen as a result of the talks between Starmer and Trump, which took place yesterday. So there was that. The Americans, Donald Trump, to the bitter disappointment of some people in the British Conservative Party, appear to have said that they have no problem with the Starmer government's decision to transfer sovereignty over some of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. This has been an issue with some people in Britain. I'm not going to pretend it's an issue that's moved the British people to any very great degree. I'm not going to go into this topic at all. I consider it a very minor one, actually, in terms of the global situation and British and American national interests. But anyway, for what it's worth, Starmer, who's come under some criticism from some people on the right over the Chagos deal, got a tepid American support for it. Again, it's hardly resounding. And that's about it. I didn't see anything else. Certainly, there was no backstop, no promise of any kind of backstop from Donald Trump for any British and French troops being sent to Ukraine as part of a peacekeeping or reassurance force. No words that could be taken away and used by the British and the French to suggest that the Americans were making any such commitment. And in fact, it was in some ways both funny and also, I have to say, for a British person, a little sad to see Trump running rings like round Starmer. Given that Trump had no difficulty running rings round Macron, he would obviously have had no difficulty running rings round Starmer. But anyway, he was running rings round Starmer, clearly enjoying himself, teasing Starmer at various points and tweaking him at others on this question. But the key point is no commitment to provide a military backstop, a guarantee to the Europeans for their vaunted peacekeeping force to Ukraine actually came. And in fact, there was one absolutely extraordinary scene when Starmer and Trump were sitting together and the television cameras were there and the media apparently were there and all sorts of officials apparently were there as well. And there was all sorts of talk, firstly, from Trump about how the British really didn't need any kind of support from the United States because British soldiers are so good. They fight so well. They're more than capable of taking account of themselves. Of course, Trump supports them all the way, but that clearly falls short of actually providing any kind of guarantee because, as Trump quickly said, they wouldn't really need any support because, well, not only are they able to take care of themselves, but of course the Russians would have no intention, obviously not, of breaking any ceasefire or peace agreement. So, the problem anyway just really doesn't exist. Anyway, that was what Trump was saying. And then there was a ludicrous scene where Starmer finally tried to come out and say, well, this has been an incredibly successful alliance between the British and the Americans, and he was talking about how successful this long-standing alliance has been and how the British support the Americans and the Americans support the British. And then, of course, Trump cut in and said, can you take on the Russians by yourself? And, of course, everybody knows that Britain can't. And there was a nervous laugh from Starmer, and everyone else in the room laughed as well. It was, well, I'm going to say it was a humiliating moment, obviously for Starmer, but I have to say it was also a message that the British really do need to hear. The United States is in a position to stand head to head with the Russians. It is a superpower. There's been a lot of talk about the problematic condition of the United States Armed Forces, which are currently going through a massive reorganization. There's a lot of talk about the problems of the American military-industrial complex and its inability to produce weapons in any huge quantities. You've heard some of those points, some of those discussions in programs on this channel. But despite all of that, despite all of those problems, which, I don't take back anything that I've said, and you can go to Brian Beletic, and he's gone into this in much more detail than I have done, and others too. Despite all of that, the United States is still a superpower. In fact, in military terms, probably it is still the premier superpower. If you take all of the various aspects of military power, the army, the air force, the navy, the submarine force, the satellite systems, all of those things, if you put them all together, Britain, of course, is nowhere close. I mean, it is a tiny force by comparison. It is a tiny force relative to the Russians too. As the British historian Mark Felton pointed out in a recent program that he did on YouTube, though the British spend as much as half of what the Russians do on defense, the Russians have armed forces that are 10 times the size of Britain's. And of course, they're now extremely experienced armed forces as well. They've fought a long and difficult war and stand at the edge of victory in it. They are far more powerful. They have a strong navy. They have perhaps the world's most advanced nuclear submarines. They're rolling out their own fifth generation fighter jets. They have their own satellite systems. And of course, they are the world's biggest nuclear power. So, Trump, with just a few words, cut the British completely down to size. So, the British, Starmer, came away with nothing. For me, personally, one of the most bizarre aspects of this whole conversation between Starmer and Trump was that Starmer at one point offered, in fact passed on to Trump, the offer of another state visit. I think that means that this would be the second state visit that Donald Trump would make to Britain, and the only time, by the way, an American president has ever been granted 2 state visits by Britain, including meetings with the king and all that. There continues to be, by the way, a strange belief in Britain that the American political class is infatuated with the British monarchy, that America, of course, rebelled against 250 years ago. I have seen no evidence of this myself at any time. Perhaps this infatuation does exist in some part of the American political system that I am unaware of. But anyway, this belief in Britain that, if the Americans get an invitation from the British royals, they will somehow roll over and give the British whatever they want. Anyway, that belief is still there with some people and doesn't ever seem quite to die. But anyway, so a completely failed visit as far as I'm concerned. I have been reading, as I said, the British media today. Starmer went to Washington with the complete support of the entire British political establishment. Though he's a Labour politician, everybody, the Conservatives, the Daily Telegraph, the Guardian, the Financial Times, they were all rooting for him. They're desperate to get this military guarantee from Donald Trump, from the United States, and they didn't get it. And, well, they can't quite bring themselves to admit that the visit was a complete failure, that Starmer came away entirely empty-handed. So we have all sorts of glowing articles about the skill with which Starmer handled Trump, whereas the reality, a better description of the meeting would be to speak of the skill with which Trump handled Starmer, just saying. But anyway, you have all of these glowing articles, but if you read them through carefully, you will not find a single concrete achievement that Starmer in fact achieved over the course of the visit, and absolutely not any movement at all on the issue which a week ago and earlier this week was supposed to be the key, central, overarching aim of the visit, which is to get this backstop, this guarantee for the European peacekeepers from the United States, so that active preparation for this deployment could now proceed. Now, I say that the British media is looking the other way, that they're pretending to themselves that all went well, but there are a few discordant voices. There is one by Madeline Grant in the Daily Telegraph, and she says that the PM gave off the air of a nerd trying to cozy up to the school bully. Not a flattering way of describing Donald Trump, but a very unflattering way of describing Keir Starmer. And the article then is utterly scathing in what it says. As Donald Trump emerged from the White House, Starmer looked nervous in the way that a small snail might look if it journeys across the bottom of the ocean floor, were interrupted by an encounter with a great white shark. And anyway, there's a lot more of that. And then we read that a fireside chat of sorts followed. The fire wasn't on, and they didn't really chat at all. The PM gave off the air of a nerd, trying to cozy up to the school bully. The president's monologues were occasionally punctuated by rather pathetic squeaks of agreement from Starmer. Bizarrely, the topic on which Sir Keir managed to talk most during the entire bilateral was the fate of Andrew Tate and his brother. That's absolutely true, by the way. It's an intellectual stretch to imagine Churchill, Roosevelt, Macmillan, JFK, even Blair and Bush discussing a pair of TikTok influencers. But anyway, that's what happened. And we then go on to read in this article that the president began a stream of consciousness about those things he did like, Vladimir Putin being one of them, and how he thought very well of the king, things like that. But anyway, the key point is that never at any point did Starmer manage to get anything concrete out of Trump. And that's the Daily Telegraph. There's another article rather similar, more hostile if anything to Trump, but also recognizing that this visit was an exercise in futility. And it's by Gabby Hinsliff in The Guardian. Trump and Starmer sat side by side, and the gulf between the two nations seemed wider than ever. And again, there's the acknowledgement that they talked about all sorts of things, but nowhere, anywhere, any commitment by the Americans, by Trump, to support the British, the French, the Europeans. And in fact, Gabby Hinsliff, who I disagree with, by the way, on most things, perhaps not everything, but certainly on most things, needs to be commended for being the only British journalist I'm aware of to say it outright. She says this: on the crucial question Starmer brought to Washington, whether America will in turn take care of its own allies, offering the military backstop without which their forces would be dangerously exposed. The best that can be said for Trump's answer that it wasn't the anticipated outright no. And even though, in effect, it amounted to that. And that's the simple thing. The visit, as I said, was a complete failure. And Gabby Hinsliff goes on to say, there will be no peace in Ukraine, nor in any other country along Russia's borders, because the Americans aren't going to be there to provide their support. I don't buy that view in any way. The Americans, though, are not budging. A European deterrent force deployed in Ukraine without US backstop risks being at best no deterrent, at worst a sitting duck. If Starmer's dignity is the price to be paid for doing a deal that could save countless lives, then frankly the Americans can have it. But that may not be enough. In other words, Starmer sacrificed his dignity but came back with nothing. So that is the reality. And that then leaves us now with Zelensky coming to Washington. And he's going to be the next person to be received by Donald Trump. And, well, he's not got the security guarantees that he was looking for. They're not in the minerals agreement that I discussed at length in my program yesterday. The minerals agreement doesn't speak of such a thing. And Zelensky's allies, his two friends, Starmer and Macron, despite all the promises he may have received, and which I believe he did receive, they weren't able to wangle that promise, that guarantee, out of the Americans either. So Zelensky is coming along and he's going to have to sign a minerals deal which, at least nominally, gives 50% of Ukraine's wealth, mineral wealth, future mineral wealth, not what's currently being produced, but also the proceeds of its ports and infrastructure and all of that, 50% of it to the United States, apparently in perpetuity. Again, Dr. Rasmus, in his article, has lots to say about this, about the vagueness and oddity of the agreement. He goes into it in much more detail than I did in my program yesterday, and much more eruditely. Anyway, Zelensky's going to have to sign this deal. There was comments by him a few days ago in which he said that he wasn't signing anything unless it came with a security guarantee. He even appeared to suggest that he might not be going to Washington after all. For a moment, I actually thought that he was actually calling his trip off after I listened to what he had to say. But he said that he wouldn't be signing anything. He insisted on security guarantees. And he's not getting them. The Americans are not providing security guarantees. So he's going to have to sign this document. And, well, the security guarantees are not there. They're not there in the document. They've not been given to Ukraine. The Americans have said that they're not going to give them to Ukraine. Donald Trump made that perfectly clear in the first cabinet meeting of the Trump cabinet that he attended. And as we saw, Zelensky's friends, Macron and Starmer, weren't able to trick Trump into giving them either. This has been a fascinating week in diplomacy, I have to say. It is diplomacy conducted in a way that I have never seen. I've never seen anything quite like this before. Usually diplomacy, when it is conducted with very carefully chosen words, with everything very carefully choreographed and prearranged, with leaders reading from carefully prepared scripts. That's the kind of diplomacy I suspect that Macron and Starmer were to some extent prepared for. It's not how Donald Trump does diplomacy. He does it in a completely different way. But this week, at least, it has been extraordinarily effective. Donald Trump has got his minerals deal, whatever that means, whatever value actually attaches to it, and he has given back nothing in return. Machiavelli, I should say, would have approved. From Machiavelli's point of view, if you read his book, his famous book, The Prince, and Machiavelli's many other writings on statecraft, he would have thoroughly approved of the way in which Trump has handled these discussions, giving every appearance of being the best friend of both Macron and Starmer, showering them with compliments, teasing and playing them, but actually giving them nothing. How Zelensky is going to respond is, of course, an entirely different matter. As I said at the start of the program, he arrived like a thief in the night. Well, maybe, as I said, that's a little bit harsh. Maybe that's, just the way that aircraft are scheduled, and maybe it's common for foreign leaders to arrive in Washington after nightfall. I don't think so somehow. It seems to me that what Zelensky is basically doing is he's coming in quietly, and he's probably going to want to leave quietly because he knows when he gets back home that people will be very, very unhappy with what he's done, with how it's played out. Now, I ought to say that over the course of the Starmer visit, Trump was talking airily about how the fact that the United States had signed this minerals deal would mean that the Americans would be there on the land, that they would be prospecting, digging up minerals and operating factories and running ports and doing all those kind of things. That's at least what Donald Trump said. Of course, that presumes that any actual aspect of the minerals agreement will ever be put into actual operation, about which there must be, as I discussed in my program yesterday, a colossal question mark. But anyway, Trump talked about that, and he said, this is actually in itself protection for Ukraine, because the mere fact that all of these people, American people, are going to be there all over Ukraine doing all of those things, that in itself is enough in and of itself to provide Ukraine with protection. Except, of course, as Dr. Rasmus, in that wonderful article that I've referenced so much in this program, pointed out that the reality is that the Americans have been busy in Ukraine. They've been all over Ukraine. American businesses have been all over Ukraine. For years, certainly going back to the February 2014 crisis, the crisis which brought the Maidan movement to power. Actually, they've been in power for much longer than that. Again, I get a quote from Dr. Rasmus. Anyone who doubts how deeply entrenched US business interests are in Ukraine should refer to the local business chambers of commerce throughout the major cities of Ukraine. They will find hundreds of subsidiaries of US corporations, let alone Ukraine businesses now indirectly owned by Western banks and investors. The penetration of US capital into Ukraine has been going on for more than a decade, since 2014 when US neocon Victoria Nuland was made economic czar for Ukraine by its parliament that year. I think that may be, by the way, a slip, just to say, I think that here Dr. Rasmus might be confusing Victoria Nuland, who, as far as I know, never had an official post of any kind in Ukraine, with Natalie Yaresko, a US citizen, and indeed, as I remember, an official at the US Embassy, who directly after the events of February 2014, the seizure of power by the Maidan movement, was granted US citizenship and became Ukraine's finance minister, in which role she served, if I remember rightly, for about a year. Just saying. But anyway, going back to Dr. Rasmus, a flood of US capital and companies followed. Trump's $500 billion fund is destined to address their interests, as well as assist and subsidize new US capital in the rebuilding of Ukraine. Well, all that may be true, the last may be true, but the point is that the Americans have already been there, and they are already there. After all, the former president's son was there. He wasn't physically there for much of the time, of course, but he was there some of the time, and he was sitting on board meetings at a Ukrainian gas company and all of that, as we all know, and lots of others of his friends were there too. Anyway, they were all there, and that didn't stop Vladimir Putin in February 2022 from launching the special military operation. And I presume that Donald Trump knows this. So when he airily says that, the presence of all of these Americans in Ukraine is somehow going to deter the Russians from defending and securing their own interests, he must know that that is wrong, and that just as it provided no deterrence before, it will provide no deterrence again. Just saying. So, there we are. A disastrous week, an extraordinary week, a disastrous week for the British and the French. Macron himself, as I said, is absolutely furious about what happened. He left Washington, and I think it took him some time for the full weight of what happened in Washington, the full weight of the failure of his diplomacy to hit home. But eventually, in the French media and even in the British media, it did. And there's been articles and comments now from EU officials, apparently anonymously, saying the truth, which is that Macron's trip to Washington was an exercise in futility and that he achieved nothing. Anyway, Macron is now bitterly speaking about the importance of Europe achieving strategic independence from the United States, of having to distance itself from the United States. He's saying things that he has, by the way, said before in the past. But here he is, he's just had this meeting with his best friend, Donald Trump, and he's saying these things again. At some point, it's also going to hit home in London as well. Both Starmer and Macron have been humiliated, and Zelensky will feel very, very let down by his friends. Now, Zelensky's real enemy, the one that he is perhaps most nervous of, Viktor Medvedchuk from Moscow, where he is in exile, has commented on all of this. He wrote a piece on a opposition Ukrainian site, which is now based in Russia. He said, Zelensky has always thought to outwit everyone and, as expected, fell into a trap that he set for others. The pathetic comedian fell into the strong hands of an American businessman, completely unaware that Trump would dictate to him the terms he wanted, and he'll just have to accept them. He, without realizing it, offered to pluck Ukraine and then boil and eat it. And Medvedchuk then goes on to say that the deal on Ukraine's minerals is in fact the beginning of its division. Zelensky has been trying to sell Ukraine in bulk and retail since 2024. And as I said, when he first floated the minerals deal, because he understands that it has no chance left. And, well, that is Medvedchuk's sour take on the whole affair. I understand it's been repeated by other people in Ukraine. Zelensky has basically sold Ukraine. In fact, he has massively oversold Ukraine in return for nothing. Well, there it is. It's important not to assume that because Donald Trump gave the Europeans and the Ukrainians the shove, that the Ukrainian conflict is anywhere close to being over, or that this process of US and Russian rapprochement will necessarily achieve some kind of positive result. Yesterday, the Russians and the Americans met in Istanbul, and the discussion was about reopening embassies. But I have to say that even as the Americans, the State Department is saying that the meeting was positive and went well, the Russians are maintaining, at least for the time being, a very, very stony silence about the meeting. There was a question about it put to Peskov, Putin's spokesman, but instead of answering it, Peskov said that this is a matter for the foreign ministry and that they should speak about it to them. So far, the Russian foreign ministry has made no comment about it at all, and I wonder whether the Russians feel that the meeting did not go especially well. Now, the Russian foreign ministry spokesman did talk about it yesterday. This was in advance of the meeting, and she did concede that it would be a very difficult meeting, that there was an awful lot to do. She said that the problematic issues have accumulated as a result of the unlawful activities of several preceding White House teams. All were bound by systemic personnel continuity and atavistic Russophobia. They deliberately erected impediments to the functioning of the Russian embassy in Washington, thereby undermining the very framework of diplomatic relations between our nations. Russia was compelled to adopt reciprocal measures. The recognition that this state of affairs cannot continue indefinitely has now become evident to the new administration in the White House. And she went on to say it is anticipated that today's meeting, she was speaking yesterday, will serve as the first in a sequence of such expert consultations, which may advance progress to resolving differences with the American side and reinforcing confidence-building measures. We underscore that commentary will be provided as news is received. The experts confront an immense volume of work. Let us therefore wish them success. Now, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman said that yesterday. She did say that there was an immense volume of work to be done. But the Russians and the Americans were both saying yesterday that they would gain from the progress of the talks yesterday some sense as to where the relationship between the United States and Russia was actually going. And I have to say this, the fact that the Russians have not so far released an account of the meeting suggests that they were less than impressed, that they feel that the meeting did not go as well as perhaps they had wanted. Well, maybe that's premature. Maybe we'll be hearing more over the course of the next few hours or perhaps tomorrow. The Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman did say that commentary will be provided as news is received. So presumably the Russians will provide their own account. But it is not a good sign that that account has not been provided as of the time of making this program. Having said that, maybe one shouldn't read too much into it. Yesterday, Donald Trump signed off an extension of the sanctions that the United States, or at least some of the sanctions that the United States has imposed on Russia. A lot of people are running away and saying that this proves that Donald Trump is not really serious about seeking to improve relations with Russia. I've seen one or two comments to that effect. Maybe it's an overstatement to say that many people are saying this. I wouldn't say that at all, actually. I would have been absolutely astonished if Donald Trump had indeed actually failed to sign off on the sanctions when they came up for renewal, until there is something definite to show, something concrete to show from these Russian-American discussions. I don't think it is politically possible for the US president to start rolling back sanctions. Just saying. Now, since I brought up the topic of sanctions, there's been a very interesting article about this in the Financial Times, one which has, by the way, provoked a certain amount of anger from some of the Financial Times readers who have spoken rather negatively about the information contained in this article on its thread. Anyway, I should say that the readers of the Financial Times seem to be overwhelmingly, well, either they're neocons, or at least neocon supporters, or, which is perhaps more probable, the neocon supporters, because of their very fierce way of expressing themselves, tend to drive off and intimidate all the others who perhaps might have different views and might express themselves in different ways. Anyway, the article, which reads, Kremlin woos Western companies to return to Russia, something, by the way, which is completely untrue. Again, I've been following the Russian media here, and my overwhelming impression is that the Russians, on balance, are unsure about whether they do, in fact, want Western companies to come back. As I discussed, I think it was in yesterday's program, the head of Lada, the Russian motor vehicle manufacturer, which now has ambitious plans of expansion and which has established strong partnerships with Chinese automakers, has made it very clear, for example, that if Renault wants to return to Russia, Renault, having owned a majority stake in Lada right up to the point of the 2022 crisis. If Renault wants to return, then it is not welcome back. Just saying. But anyway, the point is that the article basically says that if the sanctions are indeed lifted, many Western companies, including American companies, would in fact be interested in going back. Few Western multinationals are looking to rule out a return. Many want to hold on to buyback options for their Russian businesses. And we then have a Western veteran of the Russian market. These guys are commercial beings, as Lenin reportedly said. He did actually say it. The capitalist will sell you the rope by which you will hang him. And we have lots of comments about how various executives are saying that it was premature to expect a surge of big-name foreign businesses, brands returning. Many endured a painful, costly process of leaving as Moscow imposed escalating fees, regulations, and pressure to sell to powerful buyers. And in fact, some of the property of these businesses was seized and things of that kind. And in addition, the Financial Times article admits that there are all sorts of companies, businesses, Russian businesses now, which have filled the niches which were previously occupied by Western companies and Western brands. So returning to today's Russia would be a much tougher and more competitive prospect for these Western companies than it was before. But nonetheless, some of them, most of them, probably would, if they could, decide to return. And some of the companies like soft drinks makers, like Coca-Cola or Netflix, for example, might be especially eager to get back because, after all, they carry a much lighter load. They don't have to open factories with high-tech equipment and that kind of thing. So it might be relatively easy for them to go back. Well, there we are. I remember hearing many years ago, in fact, not just many years ago, but for quite a long time, being told by people who knew about these things that Western businesses, when they did finally establish a presence in Russia, found market and business conditions in Russia to be very favorable, that the businesses tended to do very well, and they were impressed by the quality and discipline of the local workforce and the strong consumer market that they were working within, and the reliability of the Russian partners. So maybe it's not surprising that they're keen to go back, but the fact is that it seems that some of them are. I'm not sure it will happen. I'm not sure it's going to happen anytime soon. And as I said, if it is the case that this meeting in Istanbul yesterday did not go especially well, then it may be that this process will take even longer than we imagine. Just saying. So, there it is. I think we've navigated through a difficult week, or at least we're about to. There's still some uncertainty about what Zelensky is going to do when he comes to the White House today. He hasn't yet gone to the White House as at the time of making of this program. He had previously said that he wouldn't sign anything unless he got a security guarantee. The US Treasury Secretary, Scott Bassett, has stepped in over the last few hours, and you've said that the deal is final. It's all there on paper. It's not going to be amended or changed, and Zelensky must sign it. So despite the absence of a security guarantee, the Americans are clearly now insisting on a signature. But it's not impossible, knowing Zelensky and what a very volatile personality he is, that he might still throw some kind of a scene. He might still decline to sign, maybe, or maybe he will say things that the Americans won't want to hear. Who knows? But overall, I think that the most dangerous moments in this week have probably now passed. The Russians and Americans are still speaking. As I said, maybe the meeting didn't go so well. But I doubt that that will be enough in itself to derail the whole process of resuming a Russian-American dialogue. The greater danger was that all of this combination of persuasion and bribes and potential threats from the Ukrainians, the British and the French would come together in some way, and that Donald Trump would be maneuvered somehow into agreeing to give the Ukrainians or the British and the French some kind of security guarantee or backstop, which he had previously ruled out doing. And that, had it happened, would have been very dangerous and would have potentially brought the entire process to a juddering stop. But that hasn't happened. And logically, given that that is so, the way forward in Russian-American contacts is still there. The process of rapprochement is also still there. Is also still there. And logically, this whole disastrous idea of sending British and French and European peacekeepers or reassurance forces, or call them whatever you like, to Ukraine should now finally be put to sleep. I'm afraid with this conflict, one can never be certain of this. There's always a chance, a possibility, perhaps even a high possibility, that this dreadful idea will be revived at some future point. It could be that the British and the French and the other Europeans will find some way to throw everything off course. But Trump, who people, I think, continue to underestimate, they always assume that he's less clever and less intuitive and less sharp than he really is. Trump has sailed through this entire week and has done so with great skill, as I said, in a way that would have had Machiavelli beaming with delight. So there we are. Now, of course, when I talk about the Europeans, they're still pressing on with their various plans. Ursula von der Leyen, and apparently all of the Europe's EU's commissioners have now gone together to India. They're all in India at the moment, where they're talking with the Indian government. They're trying to meet Prime Minister Modi. They're trying to persuade Prime Minister Modi and the Indian government to reverse policy on Russia, apparently. This is what I'm reading. And to start to enforce Western sanctions against Russia and to row back on importing Russian oil from Russia. That's what the EU people are trying to do. I think it's going to be a completely wasted journey. The Indian government, Modi, Jai Shankar, all of those people, they're certainly following very closely what's going on in the United States. They know that the Americans and the Russians are talking to each other. They know that the Americans have pulled back on the price cap idea on Russian oil and all of that. They know that the Americans are talking about an eventual lifting of sanctions. They're hardly going to burn themselves now by enforcing sanctions against the Russians in a way that would be contrary to India's own economic interests, especially when there is now a real possibility that before very long the economic sanctions, the American sanctions, are going to be lifted. Just saying. But there we are. That's the Europeans. They can't give up. They won't give up. They're pressing on. They still want somehow, in some way, to press forward with this enforcement of the sanctions. They want to wean India away from its long-standing historic friendship with the Russians. And they still think that it's worth their while, apparently, to go, all of them, the entire European Commission, to Delhi and to try to talk the Indians round. Some people, as I said, still want to live inside their own reality. That can't be helped. But anyway, there it is. That's where we are today. The Americans, Donald Trump, have sailed through this week. The British and the French have been confounded. The leaders of Britain and France, Starmer and Macron, have been humiliated. And Zelensky has been left fuming. Altogether, not a bad week's work. That's where I end today's programme. There'll be more from me soon. I expect I'll be talking again tomorrow about the military situation in Ukraine and all that, when it looks as if the whole situation in Kursk region for the Ukrainians is becoming absolutely desperate, just saying. But anyway, that's for tomorrow. This is where I have to finish today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop. Links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.